Special Report. Sexuality and Gender. Findings from the Biological, Psychological, and Social Sciences. Preface. Executive Summary. Introduction. 1. Sexual Orientation. 2. Sexuality, Mental Health Outcomes, and Social Stress. 3. Gender Identity. Conclusion. Preface. This report was written for the general public and for mental health professionals in order to draw attention to and offer some scientific insight about the mental health issues faced by LGBT populations. It arose from a request from Paul R. McHugh, MD, the former chief of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Hospital and one of the leading psychiatrists in the world. Drive. McHugh requested that I review a monograph he and colleagues had drafted on subjects related to sexual orientation and identity. My original assignment was to guarantee the accuracy of statistical inferences and to review additional sources. In the months that followed, I closely read over 500 scientific articles on these topics and perused hundreds more. I was alarmed to learn that the LGBT community bears a disproportionate rate of mental health problems compared to the population as a whole. As my interest grew, I explored research across a variety of scientific fields, including epidemiology, genetics, endocrinology, psychiatry, neuroscience, embryology, and pediatrics. I also reviewed many of the academic empirical studies done in the social sciences, including psychology, sociology, political science, economics, and gender studies. I agreed to take over as lead author, rewriting, reorganizing, and expanding the text. I support every sentence in this report, without reservation, and without prejudice regarding any political or philosophical debates. This report is about science and medicine, nothing more, and nothing less. Readers wondering about this report's synthesis of research from so many different fields may wish to know a little about its lead author. I am a full-time academic involved in all aspects of teaching, research, and professional service. I am a biostatistician and epidemiologist who focuses on the design, analysis, and interpretation of experimental and observational data in public health and medicine, particularly when the data are complex in terms of underlying scientific issues. I am a research physician, having trained in medicine and psychiatry in the UK and received the British equivalent, MB, to the American MD. I have never practiced medicine, including psychiatry, in the United States or abroad. I have testified in dozens of federal and state legal proceedings and regulatory hearings, in most cases reviewing scientific literature to clarify the issues under examination. I strongly support equality and oppose discrimination for the LGBT community, and I have testified on their behalf as a statistical expert. I have been a full-time tenured professor for over 4 decades. I have held professorial appointments at 8 universities, including Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, Stanford, Arizona State University, Johns Hopkins University, Bloomberg School of Public Health and School of Medicine, Ohio State, Virginia Tech, and the University of Michigan. I have also held research faculty appointments at several other institutions, including the Mayo Clinic. My full-time and part-time appointments have been in 23 disciplines, including statistics, biostatistics, epidemiology, public health, social methodology, psychiatry, mathematics, sociology, political science, economics, and biomedical informatics. But my research interests have varied far less than my academic appointments. The focus of my career has been to learn how statistics and models are employed across disciplines, with the goal of improving the use of models and data analytics in assessing issues of interest in the policy, regulatory, or legal realms. I have been published in many top-tier peer-reviewed journals, including the Annals of Statistics, Biometrics, and American Journal of Political Science, and have reviewed hundreds of manuscripts submitted for publication to many of the major medical, statistical, and epidemiological journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Statistical Association, and American Journal of Public Health. I am currently a scholar in residence in the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and a professor of statistics and biostatistics at Arizona State University. Up until July 1, 2016, I also held part-time faculty appointments at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and School of Medicine, and at the Mayo Clinic. An undertaking as ambitious as this report would not be possible without the counsel and advice of many gifted scholars and editors. I am grateful for the generous help of Laura E. Harrington, MD, MS, a psychiatrist with extensive training in internal medicine and neuroimmunology, whose clinical practice focuses on women in life transition, including affirmative treatment and therapy for the LGBT community. She contributed to the entire report, particularly lending her expertise to the sections on endocrinology and brain research. I am indebted also to Bentley J. Hanish, B.S., a young geneticist who expects to graduate medical school in 2021 with a M.D/PhD in psychiatric epidemiology. He contributed to the entire report, particularly to those sections that concern genetics. I gratefully acknowledge the support of Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health and School of Medicine, Arizona State University, and the Mayo Clinic. In the course of writing this report, I consulted a number of individuals who asked that I not thank them by name. Some feared an angry response from the more militant elements of the LGBT community. Others feared an angry response from the more strident elements of religiously conservative communities. Most bothersome, however, is that some feared reprisals from their own universities for engaging such controversial topics, regardless of the report's content, a sad statement about academic freedom. I dedicate my work on this report, first, to the LGBT community, which bears a disproportionate rate of mental health problems compared to population as a whole. We must find ways to relieve their suffering. I dedicate it also to scholars doing impartial research on topics of public controversy. May they never lose their way in political hurricanes. And above all, I dedicate it to children struggling with their sexuality and gender. Children are a special case when addressing gender issues. In the course of their development, many children explore the idea of being of the opposite sex. Some children may have improved psychological well-being if they are encouraged and supported in their cross-gender identification, particularly if the identification is strong and persistent over time. But nearly all children ultimately identify with their biological sex. The notion that a 2-year-old, having expressed thoughts or behaviors identified with the opposite sex, can be labeled for life as transgender has absolutely no support in science. Indeed, it is iniquitous to believe that all children who have gender-atypical thoughts or behavior at some point in their development, particularly before puberty, should be encouraged to become transgender. As citizens, scholars, and clinicians concerned with the problems facing LGBT people, we should not be dogmatically committed to any particular views about the nature of sexuality or gender identity. Rather, we should be guided first and foremost by the needs of struggling patients, and we should seek with open minds for ways to help them lead meaningful, dignified lives. Lawrence S. Mayer, M.B., M.S., Ph.D. Empty line introduction. Lawrence S. Mayer, Paul R. McHugh. Few topics are as complex and controversial as human sexual orientation and gender identity. These matters touch upon our most intimate thoughts and feelings, and help to define us as both individuals and social beings. Discussions of the ethical questions raised by sexual orientation and gender identity can become heated and personal, and the associated policy issues sometimes provoke intense controversies. The disputants, journalists, and lawmakers in these debates often invoke the authority of science, and in our news and social media and our broader popular culture we hear claims about what science says on these matters. This report offers a careful summary and an up-to-date explanation of many of the most rigorous findings produced by the biological, psychological, and social sciences related to sexual orientation and gender identity. We examine a vast body of scientific literature from several disciplines. We try to acknowledge the limitations of the research and to avoid premature conclusions that would result in overinterpretation of scientific findings. Since the relevant literature is rife with inconsistent and ambiguous definitions, we not only examine the empirical evidence but also delve into underlying conceptual problems. This report does not, however, discuss matters of morality or policy. Our focus is on the scientific evidence, what it shows and what it does not show. We begin in part 1 by critically examining whether concepts such as heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality represent distinct, fixed, and biologically determined properties of human beings. As part of this discussion, we look at the popular born that way hypothesis, which posits that human sexual orientation is biologically innate. We examine the evidence for this claim across several subspecialties of the biological sciences. We explore the developmental origins of sexual attractions, the degree to which such attractions may change over time, and the complexities inherent in the incorporation of these attractions into one's sexual identity. Drawing on evidence from twin studies and other types of research, we explore genetic, environmental, and hormonal factors. We also explore some of the scientific evidence relating brain science to sexual orientation. In part 2, we examine research on health outcomes as they relate to sexual orientation and gender identity. There is a consistently observed higher risk of poor physical and mental health outcomes for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender subpopulations compared to the general population. These outcomes include depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and most alarmingly, suicide. For example, among the transgender subpopulation in the United States, the rate of attempted suicide is estimated to be as high as 41%, 10 times higher than in the general population. As physicians, academics, and scientists, we believe all of the subsequent discussions in this report must be cast in the light of this public health issue. We also examine some ideas proposed to explain these differential health outcomes, including the social stress model. This hypothesis, which holds that stressors like stigma and prejudice account for much of the additional suffering observed in these subpopulations, does not seem to offer a complete explanation for the disparities in the outcomes. Much as Part 1 investigates the conjecture that sexual orientation is fixed with a causal biological basis, a portion of Part 3 examines similar issues with respect to gender identity. Biological sex, the binary categories of male and female, is a fixed aspect of human nature, even though some individuals affected by disorders of sex development may exhibit ambiguous sex characteristics. By contrast, gender identity is a social and psychological concept that is not well defined, and there is little scientific evidence that it is an innate, fixed biological property. Part 3 also examines sex reassignment procedures and the evidence for their effectiveness at alleviating the poor mental health outcomes experienced by many people who identify as transgender. Compared to the general population, postoperative transgender individuals continue to be at high risk of poor mental health outcomes. An area of particular concern involves medical interventions for gender nonconforming youth. They are increasingly receiving therapies that affirm their felt genders, and even hormone treatments or surgical modifications at young ages. But the majority of children who identify as a gender that does not conform to their biological sex will no longer do so by the time they reach adulthood. We are disturbed and alarmed by the severity and irreversibility of some interventions being publicly discussed and employed for children. Sexual orientation and gender identity resist explanation by simple theories. There is a large gap between the certainty with which beliefs are held about these matters and what a sober assessment of the science reveals. In the face of this complexity and uncertainty, we need to be humble about what we know and do not know. We readily acknowledge that this report is neither an exhaustive analysis of the subjects it addresses nor the last word on them. Science is by no means the only avenue for understanding these astoundingly complex, multifaceted topics. There are other sources of wisdom and knowledge, including art, religion, philosophy, and lived human experience. And much of our scientific knowledge in this area remains unsettled. However, we offer this overview of the scientific literature in the hope that it can provide a shared framework for intelligent, enlightened discourse in political, professional, and scientific exchanges, and may add to our capacity as concerned citizens to alleviate suffering and promote human health and flourishing. Empty line Part 1, Sexual Orientation. Lawrence S. Mayer, Paul R. McHugh. While some people are under the impression that sexual orientation is an innate, fixed, and biological trait of human beings that, whether heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, we are born that way, there is insufficient scientific evidence to support that claim. In fact, the concept of sexual orientation itself is highly ambiguous. It can refer to a set of behaviors, to feelings of attraction, or to a sense of identity. Epidemiological studies show a rather modest association between genetic factors and sexual attractions or behaviors, but do not provide significant evidence pointing to particular genes. There is also evidence for other hypothesized biological causes of homosexual behaviors, attractions, or identity, such as the influence of hormones on prenatal development, but that evidence, too, is limited. Studies of the brains of homosexuals and heterosexuals have found some differences, but have not demonstrated that these differences are inborn rather than the result of environmental factors that influence both psychological and neurobiological traits. One environmental factor that appears to be correlated with non-heterosexuality is childhood sexual abuse victimization, which may also contribute to the higher rates of poor mental health outcomes among non-heterosexual subpopulations, compared to the general population. Overall, the evidence suggests some measure of fluidity in patterns of sexual attraction and behavior, contrary to the born that way notion that oversimplifies the vast complexity of human sexuality. Contents. Problems with defining key concepts. Voice recording.